Every moral system, every act of worship, every promise of heaven, and every threat of hell depends on one fragile assumption: that you are free to choose, that your decisions are yours, that your thoughts belong to you, that when you reach for good or fall into evil, it was you who chose the path. But what if that freedom is an illusion? Science tests causality. Philosophy tests coherence. But today, we test religion's most sacred assumption: human free will. Because if this fails, everything fails with it. Without freedom, there is no sin. Without choice, there is no virtue. Without agency, there is no meaning and reward, and no justice and punishment. The foundation of morality, the architecture of salvation, all of it rests on one question: are you truly free, or are you following a script written before you were born? Imagine a hand flipping a light switch labeled choice. But behind the wall, hidden from sight, gears turn on their own. Gears you never built. Gears you never control. The light flickers on, and you believe it was you. This is the illusion of choice. And when we test it, not with emotion, but with logic, evidence, and observation, we'll see whether religion's claim of free will can survive the scrutiny. Because if the freedom we've been promised turns out to be an illusion, then every doctrine built upon it collapses with it. So stay with me. Watch closely. Listen carefully. And if this investigation challenges what you've always believed, don't turn away. That moment of discomfort is where truth begins. If you value questioning over comfort, if you believe truth deserves courage, like this video, share it, and subscribe. Because the free will test begins now. Before we can test anything, we need to know exactly what we're testing. The Warrant Free Will test is built on the same two principles that guide every serious investigation: internal consistency and empirical observation. Internal consistency asks a simple question: can a belief system hold together without contradicting itself? Empirical observation asks another: do its claims match what we actually see in reality? If a theory fails either one, it collapses. So what happens when we apply these same rules to the idea of human free will? When we take this sacred concept, the one religion depends on for sin, salvation, and justice, and run it through the same filters of reason that every scientific theory must face, the free will test asks three brutal questions. First, is genuine choice even logically possible under divine omniscience? If God already knows every decision you will ever make, down to the last heartbeat, how could you ever do otherwise? Second, is moral responsibility possible if every outcome is predetermined? If every action, every thought, every temptation was known before you existed, can you truly be held accountable for acting out a script you didn't write? And third, is freedom meaningful? If God directly shapes your thoughts, your emotions, and the circumstances that define your choices, if every influence comes from the mind of God, what's left that can truly be called yours? These aren't small questions. They are existential detonations aimed at the very heart of moral theology, because the stakes could not be higher. If free will doesn't exist, then morality, sin, and salvation lose all meaning. Every sermon, every commandment, every act of judgment becomes nothing more than divine puppetry. But if free will does exist, then God cannot be all-knowing or all-powerful, because true freedom means unpredictability. It means actions even God could not foresee or prevent. Either way, the test has no survivor, and what we discover next will decide whether the entire idea of moral responsibility stands or falls. The first test begins with one of the oldest and most dangerous claims in all of theology. God knows everything. Past, present, future. Every thought you'll ever have. Every word you'll ever speak. Every decision you'll ever make. It sounds comforting until you test it. Because if God already knows your choices before you make them, then those choices are already fixed. If He knows what you'll do tomorrow, then tomorrow cannot unfold any other way. And if it could unfold differently, then His knowledge was wrong. But an all-knowing God cannot be wrong, which means you cannot be free. Let's make it concrete. If God infallibly knows that you'll lie at 9 a.m. tomorrow, can you truly choose to tell the truth? If you tell the truth, then His foreknowledge was mistaken. If you lie, then you had no real choice. You simply acted out what was already known. Every alternate future, every possibility you thought you had, is already deleted by omniscience. And yet, religion insists you are free. Free to obey, free to sin, free to choose your eternal destiny. But how can freedom exist in a world where every decision is already known, every action already witnessed, every ending already written? This is not freedom. It's choreography, a perfectly scripted play performed on the stage of inevitability. And that illusion has been defended for centuries. In the 4th century, 2 voices clashed over this very question. Augustine Huss argued that humans could not will anything good without divine grace, that our freedom was corrupted and true choice belonged only to God's will. Pelagius, a British monk, disagreed. He insisted that moral responsibility meant real choice, that without freedom, sin and virtue are meaningless. The Church declared Pelagius a heretic. Freedom itself became heresy, and Augustine's vision of a God who determines all outcomes became the foundation of Christian theology. 1,000 years later, John Calvin took it further. He declared that before time began, God had already chosen who would be saved and who would be damned, not by deeds, not by faith, by decree. Calvin called it predestination, a moral system that rewards and punishes for choices never freely made. Imagine the psychological weight of that belief. A world where every prayer, every confession, every act of faith was already decided before your birth. The comfort of divine control, disguising the terror of absolute determinism. Predestination is not faith in God's plan. It is the death of choice, disguised as prophecy. And that same logic seeps quietly through every sermon today. When believers say, God already knows what you'll do, they are repeating the same paradox, a contradiction no doctrine can escape. Because if the future is already known, it cannot be changed. And if it cannot be changed, you cannot choose. The defense is always the same. God's knowledge doesn't cause your actions. He simply knows them. But this changes nothing. If God knows that you will lie tomorrow, then it's impossible for you not to lie. His knowledge and your action are perfectly aligned, inseparable. Knowledge without causation still binds the outcome. The moment God infallibly knows an event, that event becomes fixed in reality. It's like a book already written. You can read it from start to finish, but you cannot rewrite a single word. The belief in divine foreknowledge is the belief that every human life is a story already printed, We just haven't turned the last page yet. Religion calls it destiny. Philosophy calls it determinism. But under the microscope of logic, they're the same thing. The illusion of freedom is preserved only by refusing to ask the question. But once you do, once you see how divine foreknowledge erases every possible alternative, you realize that free will isn't sacred. It's sacrificed. For centuries, theologians tried to patch this hole. Some said, God exists outside of time. He sees all moments at once. But that only makes it worse. If God sees all time simultaneously, then every event is eternally fixed. No moment can unfold differently. Others said, foreknowledge doesn't force choice, but force isn't the issue. Inevitability is. A future known with certainty is a future that cannot be otherwise. This is the first casualty of the free will test. Foreknowledge and freedom cannot coexist. If God knows every choice you'll make, you cannot choose otherwise. If you can choose otherwise, God cannot know with certainty what you'll do. The contradiction is absolute. Test, result, fail. Freedom cannot coexist with omniscient certainty. The second test begins with a premise that most believers never question. If God sustains all things at every moment, then every atom that moves by His permission. Every heartbeat, every breath, every neuron that fires inside your skull, all of it held together by divine power. It sounds poetic, reassuring. But when you follow that logic to its end, something terrifying appears. If God sustains everything, then He sustains every cause. And if He sustains every cause, then He also sustains every effect, which means every thought, every desire, every action exists only because God allows it. Or rather, because God causes it. That includes compassion and cruelty, kindness and murder, charity and sin. If He causes every cause, He causes sin. If He doesn't cause sin, then He doesn't sustain all things. Either way, the definition breaks. Here's the logical paradox in full. A God who causes everything cannot avoid causing evil. A God who doesn't cause evil cannot be the cause of everything. One of those statements must fall. And whichever one you save destroys omnipotence. Theologians have long tried to escape this trap with a phrase they call secondary causation. They say God is the primary cause. He creates the world and its laws. Humans are secondary causes. We operate within those laws. It sounds like a solution. But it's linguistic camouflage. Because if God designed the entire system, including every condition, influence, and response, then secondary causes are just primary causes wearing masks. A domino doesn't choose to fall. It falls because another domino hit it. And that domino fell because another one pushed it. Follow the chain back far enough, and every motion begins with the same hand. The divine cause. Visualize it. A line of dominoes stretching into infinity. At one end, a single finger taps the first tile. Every fall that follows is already determined. That's omnipotence, not freedom. Sequence. Let's bring it down to reality. Consider the impulses we call sin, anger, addiction, jealousy, violence. Every one of them emerges from patterns in the brain, chemistry and wiring shaped by genetics and environment. And if God designed both, then He designed the mechanisms that make those impulses inevitable. A person born into trauma, genetically predisposed to rage, raised in conditions that reinforce aggression, was their choice ever truly free? If environment and biology build the pathways that produce action, and those pathways are designed or sustained by God, then where does choice fit? If He made the blueprint, authored the code, and keeps the program running every millisecond, then every line of behavior is written by His own hand. The escape route is always the same. God allows evil, but doesn't cause it. But permission and causation are inseparable in an omnipotent system. If God can stop an act and chooses not to, His allowance is causation by omission. To say He allows is simply to describe a choice to let it happen. A choice made with full power, full awareness, and full responsibility. That's not permission. That's authorship. The conclusion is unavoidable. If God sustains all things, He sustains every sin. If He does not sustain every sin, He does not sustain all things. Either He's not omnipotent or we're not free. Test. Result. Fail. Total causation erases independent agency. The third and final test is where theology meets morality head-on. Every major religion makes the same claim. God rewards obedience. God punishes disobedience. Heaven or hell, the ultimate destinations of the soul, depend entirely on the choices you make. It sounds just. It sounds moral. Until you remember what we've already discovered. If every choice is already foreknown, and every cause is sustained by divine power, then punishment and reward become judgment against a design. If God wrote the script and you only acted it out, then heaven and hell are nothing more than consequences for a story He Himself created. It's like an engineer building a robot, programming it to fail, then condemning it for malfunctioning exactly as programmed. That isn't justice. That's cruelty in mathematical form. And yet, for centuries, this system has been called moral perfection. Think about the emotional toll. Entire generations have lived and died under the weight of guilt for actions they never truly chose. People are told, "You sinned because you wanted to." But who designed those wants? Who designed the chemical storm that forms temptation in the first place? If your desires are written in your DNA, and your DNA is written by God, then where does personal blame begin? This is where theology becomes a form of moral gaslighting. It tells you that you're responsible for impulses designed by another being, that your failures are personal, but your creation was perfect. You're told to repent, to beg forgiveness for acting according to the conditions you never chose. Your body, your mind, your environment, your history, everything that shaped you was chosen by someone else, yet you're the one held accountable for how it plays out. And the emotional damage is staggering. Millions live haunted by invisible judgment. Believers blaming themselves for thoughts that weren't chosen, for habits born of trauma, for desires that evolution or divinity built into them. The result is a lifetime of shame without agency. A moral system that punishes inevitability isn't justice. It's design pretending to be fairness. But there's another layer, one that science has already exposed. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet performed experiments on human decision-making. He asked volunteers to flex their wrists whenever they felt the urge, and he measured brain activity down to the millisecond. The result stunned philosophy. The brain began preparing to move hundreds of milliseconds before the person became consciously aware of the decision to move. In other words, the body decided before the mind realized it had decided. Every repetition of the experiment confirmed the same pattern. The conscious "I choose" arrives after The brain has already initiated the action. Free will, it turns out, isn't the beginning of the process. It's the story the brain tells after the process has already started. Our sense of choosing is a reconstruction, not a cause. If even neuroscience shows that freedom is an afterthought, then the theological claim of divine judgment collapses entirely. Because religion adds one more layer of control on top of biology. Not only does your brain decide before your awareness, but an all-knowing, all-powerful being supposedly decides the conditions that make those decisions inevitable. And then, he judges you for them. This turns the idea of divine justice into an impossible equation. If God knows and causes all, he is judging his own work. If he doesn't know or cause all, he's not omniscient or omnipotent. Either the system is unjust or the definition of God collapses. There is no third option. Moral responsibility cannot exist in a universe where outcomes are both known and caused before the actor exists. And punishment in such a system is not righteousness. It's tyranny disguised as holiness. Test result: fail. Judgment loses moral coherence without freedom. Every time the contradictions become clear, defenders of faith reach for the same three escape routes. Each one sounds sophisticated, each one feels comforting, and each one destroys its own foundation. Let's take them one by one. The first defense: foreknowledge doesn't cause action. They say, God's knowledge doesn't make you choose. He simply knows what you'll choose. At first, that seems harmless, like watching a movie for the second time. Knowing the ending doesn't change the scenes. But that's the wrong analogy, because God isn't a spectator. He's the writer, the director, the producer, and the architect of every atom in the universe. If he created the system, designed the characters, and set every condition under which choices are made, then his foreknowledge isn't passive observation. It's authorship. Knowing every decision before it happens and creating the world that guarantees those decisions isn't non-causal. It's total causation disguised as prediction. Omniscience plus creation equals authorship, not spectatorship. The film doesn't surprise the writer. It unfolds exactly as written. So if God knows everything that will happen because he made everything that will happen, then he's not foreseeing. He's watching his own script play out. That's not freedom. That's storytelling. The second defense: God exists outside of time. They argue, God doesn't predict the future. He sees all moments simultaneously. Every event is eternally present to him. But think about what that means. If every event is eternally present, then no event can unfold differently. There is no alternate timeline, no real possibility. Timelessness doesn't solve foreknowledge. It cements determinism. In a frozen, eternal view, the future is as fixed as the past. Nothing can change because every moment already is. The phrase outside of time is poetic camouflage for absolute predestination. It replaces a moving story with a static photograph. And in that photograph, you're not choosing anything. You're a still frame in an image that can never be altered. So when theologians claim timelessness preserves freedom, they're saying that being permanently frozen somehow makes you more free. It's self-defeating. Now the third defense: freedom within divine plan. This one is popular because it sounds balanced. They'll say, yes, God has a plan, but within that plan, humans are free. But what does freedom mean if the outcome of every choice is already planned? That's not freedom. That's programmed outcome. rebranded as liberty. It's like a video game where every ending has already been coded. You can wander anywhere you want, but the credits always roll the same way. To call that freedom is to play a semantic trick. Thomas Aquinas did it centuries ago. He wrote that God moves the human will without violating its liberty. But how can you move a will and call it untouched? It's like steering a ship and insisting the wheel is steering itself. John Calvin repeated the same contradiction. God ordains every act, yet humans are responsible for those acts. He called it a holy mystery. But mystery isn't logic. It's surrender, disguised as wisdom. Every attempt to reconcile freedom with divine control ends by redefining one or the other until both lose meaning. If freedom means doing what's already decreed, it's not freedom. If God's plan can change, He's not omniscient. So each defense collapses under its own claim. Foreknowledge doesn't cause action, fails, because knowledge and creation are inseparable. God exists outside of time, fails, because timelessness locks every event in place. Freedom within divine plan fails because predetermined outcomes cannot coexist with open choice. Science faces the same kind of tests. When a theory fails, scientists revise the model. They change definitions only when new evidence demands it. Religion does the opposite. When the logic fails, it simply redefines the words. And that's the most telling difference of all. Defense review, fail. All counter-arguments self-cancel. Logic reveals contradiction. Observation confirms illusion. Because once we leave philosophy and step into psychology, we find that human behavior matches determinism far more than freedom. Across cultures, across centuries, people have shown a powerful need to believe that outcomes are meant to be. Psychologists call it cognitive bias. The human tendency to justify whatever happens as part of a larger plan. Lose your job? It was meant to happen. Find love? It was destiny. Survive an accident? God spared me for a reason. We don't explain events through freedom. We explain them through fate. It comforts us. It removes uncertainty. It gives chaos a script. But in doing so, it quietly erases our own agency. The same pattern appears in one of the most famous psychological studies ever conducted, Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments. Participants were told to administer electric shocks to another person in the next room. Each time the student made an error, the teacher was ordered to increase the voltage. As the screams grew louder, many participants hesitated. But when the man in the white lab coat said, "The experiment requires that you continue," most obeyed. They pressed the switch. Even when they believed they were causing real harm, they surrendered their moral agency to authority. Why? Because when a higher power commands, the human brain finds safety in obedience. Responsibility transfers upward. Now compare that to religion. Believers are taught that every event is orchestrated by God's will, that every outcome has divine purpose, that every command, no matter how harsh, must be followed. The result is the same psychological mechanism: agency outsourcing. When a person prays before making a decision, "God, guide me to the right choice," they are not exercising freedom. They are transferring it. Every hesitation, every moral burden is handed back to the higher power. If things go well, it was God's will. If they go wrong, it was also God's will. Freedom becomes theater. The script was already written. And the emotional cost of this surrender is enormous. People live in cycles of guilt and paralysis. terrified of making the wrong choice, waiting for divine approval, haunted by fear of disappointing a being who supposedly controls everything already. It's a paradox of devotion. The more control God is given, the less remains for the believer. Picture it. A person suspended by invisible strings, each one labeled God's plan, destiny, sin. They move, they struggle, but the strings decide where they go. And when they stop, they call the stillness peace. Observation confirms what logic already exposed, that the human mind is built to surrender control and then rename its submission faith. External consistency, fail. Behavior matches determinism, not free will. If there is no true free will, then morality itself begins to unravel. Sin and virtue no longer describe choices. They describe outcomes, pre-written actions performed on schedule. Every act of kindness, every act of cruelty, every prayer, every betrayal, all of it becomes code, executed exactly as designed. And in that world, heaven and hell lose all meaning. The justice system of eternity turns into cosmic theater, a play where the script never changes, but the actors are punished or rewarded for reading their lines. That is not morality. That is pageantry disguised as judgment. Imagine calling someone good for breathing on cue, or condemning them for the heartbeat they couldn't stop. That's what divine justice becomes when freedom is gone. It's what I call the moral lottery. A game where your eternal fate was drawn before you existed. Some are born into salvation, others into damnation, all according to a script you never had the chance to edit. And yet, you're told it's fair. You're told it's love. But in every other context, we know better. We don't imprison the wind for blowing in the wrong direction. We don't arrest the ocean for creating a storm. We don't punish the rain for falling on the innocent. Because we understand they have no choice. So why does religion hold humanity to a higher standard than it holds its own creator? If every action is sustained by divine will, then every sin belongs to that will. If every thought is authored by omniscience, then every failure was written in advance. The logic collapses inward. Moral accountability dissolves. Spinoza saw it centuries ago. He wrote that everything in nature follows necessity, and that blaming anyone for acting according to that necessity is ignorance, not justice. Even Dostoevsky's sinners understood the paradox. Without freedom, he wrote, there is no virtue. And yet religion insists on preserving both determinism and blame. It cannot give up control, but it cannot justify punishment either. A system that condemns pre-programmed behavior isn't moral, it's incoherent. System failure, morality without freedom, is incoherent. Behind every argument, behind every theory and test, there are real people. People who lived inside this paradox. People who tried to be free, inside a system that never allowed them to be. One former believer told me quietly, I prayed to want different desires, then blamed myself when they didn't change. Another said, my choices felt like tests I was programmed to fail. They weren't angry. They were exhausted. Exhausted from carrying guilt for thoughts they never chose, for instincts they were told were evil, for lives they believed were under constant surveillance. Some of them spent years begging God to fix the parts of themselves He supposedly designed. And when nothing changed, they turned the blame inward. They thought their failure proved their unworthiness. But it didn't. It proved the system was broken. This isn't mockery. It's empathy. Because the tragedy isn't that these people lost faith. It's that faith taught them to doubt their own humanity. They were trapped in a cage built from impossible standards. And when they couldn't escape, they thought it was their fault. But it wasn't. It never was. The results are in. Test 1. Foreknowledge versus freedom. Fail. Test 2. Omnipotence versus causation. Fail. Test 3. Judgment versus morality. Fail. Psychological evidence. Fail. Every version of the claim collapses under its own weight. Every escape route leads back to contradiction. And every attempt to preserve both divine control and human choice ends by erasing one or both. If divine freedom destroys human freedom, then worship itself becomes obedience without choice, love without consent. And love without consent isn't love at all. For centuries, religion told us that surrendering our will to God was the highest virtue. But if our will never truly existed, then surrender was never ours to give. What survives this collapse isn't despair, it's responsibility. Because when we stop outsourcing choice to the heavens, we begin to build morality from understanding, not fear. From empathy, not command. From courage, not obedience. Freedom doesn't descend from above. It emerges from awareness, from the honesty to admit that meaning isn't given to us. We create it. The free will test leaves religion with no survivors, but it leaves humanity with a new beginning. The courage to choose meaning for ourselves. Now it's your turn. Run this test on your own beliefs. Look for the contradictions you were taught not to see, and share your results in the comments, because the free will test isn't just about theology, it's about truth and the strength to face it.